Hello and welcome to installment number 2 of This Week in Mishna Yomi. This week's topic that I'd like to discuss is Hefker based in Hefker. The source for this topic related to Mishna Yomi is 2 Mishnayos in Peah that we recently learned. In Peah, chapter 5, Mishnah 1, talks about how if poor people miss out on leket and then it gets mixed in with other produce. So the Mishnah says that the entire bottom layer of produce on the ground becomes leket, even if we know that some of that produce is not leket. In other words, let's say the field that's being harvested is wheat, and because it was left there and not the poor people were not given access in time, it gets mixed in with another grain, with barley. And so you have wheat and barley. Wheat is the only thing that's really eligible for leket, but barley is mixed in. The layer closest to the ground, even if it has some barley mixed in, will become leket and belong to the ani, the poor person, and the poor person does not have to separate maasrot from that from that produce that's now identified as leket. Now the Gemara Talmid Yerushalmi in Shkalim Daf Gimel Amud Aleph quotes an opinion of Reish Lakish that this idea that the lowest level of produce is completely considered leket and belongs to the ani is consistent with the position of Beis Shammai, who in the next chapter, chapter 6, Mishnah Aleph, holds hefker la'aniyim hefker. In other words, if a owner of a field is mafker, declares ownerless a selection of his produce, with the caveat being that it is hefker, it is ownerless only for poor people. Only poor people can go ahead and take ownership of it. For other people, for non-poor people, those who are not eligible for leket, it's not ownerless. It remains in the ownership of the Baal Bayit, the owner of the field. So does that work? Hefker la'aniyim. So Beis Shammai is the one that says yes, you can make something hefker exclusively vis-a-vis the aniyim, and therefore that entire layer, because it's hefker la'aniyim, hefker, that's the mechanism through which the Mishnah in Peah chapter 5, Mishnah 1 is working with. The fact that the bottom layer of produce, even though it's a mix of, let's say, wheat and barley, all belongs to the aniyim, is considered leket and is exempt from maasros. That Reish Lakish said is only based on only works according to the opinion of Beis Shammai that we learn about in the Mishnah in the next chapter, chapter 6, Mishnah 1, that hefker la'aniyim is indeed hefker. However, according to Beis Hillel, hefker la'aniyim is not hefker. In other words, the only way you can have hefker, the only way that something actually becomes ownerless, is if it's ownerless l'chol adam, if it's ownerless for all people. If you make something ownerless only for aniyim, it's not ownerless for anyone. It remains in the possession of the owner, and if he gives it to someone, fine. Then it's not leket. It doesn't belong to the ani as leket. And if the ani is given ownership of this produce on the bottom layer, as discussed in Mishnah in chapter 5, then it's not leket. The ani can take ownership of it if it's with the permission of the Baal Bayit of the field, but it would not be leket insofar as it would be obligated. That produce that the ani collects is not leket, and therefore liable for the to separate maasrot from. That's the opinion of Reish Lakish. Again, this is all in the Gemara Talmid Yerushalmi Shkalim Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. Whereas Rav Yossi says, so according to this opinion, whether or not this leket on the bottom layer is subject to maasrot is dependent on the machloket whether hefker la'aniyim is hefker. According to Beis Shammai, hefker la'aniyim is hefker, and therefore it's leket and pater for maasrot. A little complicated. However, according to Beit Hillel, as understood by Reish Lakish, hefker la'aniyim is not hefker, and this is a transaction, doesn't become leket, and therefore it is subject to separating maasrot. Rav Yossi says no. Even according to Beis Hillel, this lowest level of produce is all exempt from maasros, right? How does it become? It's not leket. The only way it can be leket is if it was Hefker, and according to Beis Hillel, it's not Hefker, because Hefker Laniyim doesn't work. Rather, so Rav Yossi says, no, the reason why, even according to Beis Hillel, this bottom layer of produce is transferred to the ani, the poor person, and is not subject to taking Trumas and Maasros from, is because this is a penalty, a knas d'Rabbanan. The rabbis penalized the owner of the field for not ensuring that the poor people could have access to their real leket before additional produce got mixed in. So it's a knas. And the knas works in such a way that because the rabbis wanted to discourage this laziness on the part of the Baal Bayis and ensure that leket is picked up in a timely fashion, so they penalize the owner of the field, and that entire layer belongs to the ani and is exempt from maasros and belongs like leket. How could that be? So it's not because hefker laniyim hefker, because that can't be a declaration of ownerlessness. Only works if it applies to everyone according to Beis Hillel. Hefker laniyim is not hefker, but says Rav Yossi, hefker based in is hefker. In other words, the rabbis, because they wanted to penalize the owner of the field, said that that entire section is completely hefker. And because it's hefker, the ani comes along, and hefker based in hefker. If based in declares something that is owned by someone to now be ownerless, that declaration has status, has standing, has stature, and therefore it works. And now the ani can collect that bottom layer as leket and not have to take off maasro. So I wanted to talk a little bit about hefker based in hefker today. The rabbis are empowered to make property ownerless, even if it until now it was owned by a specific person whom we could identify. This is the one of the source gemaras of this is a gemara that I'm in the middle of in Daf HaShavua, which meets Tuesday mornings after the 8 a.m. minyan in the library. Yevamot, page Pei Tes Amud Beis 89b is a source for hefker beis and hefker, and there are two psukim in Nach that are used as source texts for this idea. One of them is a pasuk in Ezra chapter 10, verse 8, where Ezra makes a declaration: "V'chol asher lo yavo l'shloshes hayamim katzas hasarim v'azkenim yacharam kol rechusho." Anyone that did not come in 3 days would, by decision of the officers and elders, have his property confiscated. How can you just confiscate property? No, this is exactly the idea, that it's possible to confiscate property based on the notion of hefker based in hefker. Other Mefarshim say that was a one-shot deal. That was a small window of time where Ezra was working to bring people back to Israel and had certain requirements of those who were in Israel, but it was for a short period of time. We talk about 3 days, for instance. Well, how do we know that this is an ongoing power that the rabbis have of hefker based in hefker? So then others point to a pasuk in Yoshua chapter 19, verse 51, where it talks about the portioning the land of Israel. Yoshua ben Nun Rashi Avos Lamatos b'nei Yisrael. We know that the apportioning of the land was done through the Urim Tumim, right? That they would decide which land, which section of Israel would go to which tribe. And that's what it says. These are the portions assigned by Lot to the tribes of Israel by the priest Elazar. But then it goes on to say not only was it assigned by Elazar, but also by Yoshua ben Nun and the heads of the Matei Avos b'nei Israel. What's this idea of that the heads of the ancestral homes were also involved? So here too, the Mefarshim say this is a source text to the idea that based in some authority, some leadership authority, the judiciary, Roshei Hamatot, they have the ability to assign portions, because they have the ability that even if you think you owned it, they can remove your ownership rights to it and assign them, thereby assigning them to someone else. So hefker based in hefker has a source text, a support in Ezra chapter 10, Yoshua chapter 19. And even though the Rishonim say, even though these psukim are in Navi, nonetheless, the power of hefker based in hefker is min haTorah, right? And we'll see that it can have ramifications of undoing things, statuses that were viewed as legitimate statuses on a Torah level comes along Hefker Beis Din Hefker and undoes that. Let's give some examples of how Hefker Beis Din Hefker can work in the real world. Because even though Beis Din is not allowed to uproot or nullify a Torah status in an affirmative way, right? Chachamim are not allowed to oker davar min Torah bikum v'aseh. They can't affirmatively come along and undo something that the Torah on a Torah level has standing. Nonetheless, anything related to money, they do have that ability through Hefker Beis Din Hefker. Let me give you a couple of examples of Hefker Beis Din Hefker. So, for instance, returning a lost object, Hashavat Aveda, there's an obligation to return a lost object with simanim. Person gives you signs, a person gives you proofs that it was his, right? We say that simanim, the idea that these signs are proof positive that it belongs to that person, is on a Durabanan level. And yet we say that the obligation is to give back that item. I find something, it has simanim that another person declares, I have to give it back to that person. Why? Even though the simanim are only Durabanan, because Hefker Beis Din Hefker. So even though I'm holding it, Beis Din has the authority, has the right, the theoretical right that they can exercise if necessary, to take that item that I found out of my possession and give it back to whom we now consider to be the rightful owner based on simanim. There's a halacha that divrei shchiv meira kesuvim musar and dami, that the words of a deathly ill person on their deathbed, even though normally we need a person to make a kinyan or to write it out to indicate that he is of sound mind to transfer an item, to give it as a gift to someone else, but divrei shchiv meira, the words of a person who is on their deathbed, is as binding as a kinyan, as binding as if it was written out in a document. Why? How does that work? So the underlying way that works is Hefker Beis Din Hefker. The rabbis wanted to give credence and stature, not to everything or anything, not to everything that a Shchiv Meirah says, but many things that a Shchiv Meirah might say on their deathbed. The mechanism through which that works, we transfer something that belongs to the Shchiv Meirah to someone else, or something that belongs, that's in the possession of someone else, that really belongs to the Shchiv Meirah, and we transfer it to someone else. How does that work? Hefker Beis Din Hefker. There's a couple of other examples. Well, actually, Hafkas Kedushin. This is a complicated one, but this is an interesting one because it transitions over not only into Dinei Mamanis as it relates to property objects, things that are owned. The Chacham can come along and say, you no longer own it, and now it belongs to someone else, right? But a little bit like eminent domain. But what happens here by Hafkad Kedushin, if the rabbis want to annul a marriage that took place, and again, this is used very sparingly, but the concept exists. How does that work? How do you undo a Kedushin? What's the mechanism through which that could happen? So they explain it's based on Hefker Beis Din Hefker. That if, again, this only works if a man and woman get married through the transfer of a ring, right? They got married through the transfer of the ring. The rabbis come along and say that ring didn't belong to that individual. So the ring didn't belong to them, so they're not married. So Hefker Beis Din Hefker allows for a Hafkas Kedushin, an uprooting of the Kedushin. Now, it's not so simple, because what we're doing is we're retrospectively taking it out of the man's possession before he gave it to the woman. And now we're, 10 days or 10 years later, the woman has had possession of this ring since the day of her wedding. So what the mechanism that we're trying to use as Hefker Beis Din Hefker is that the rabbis go back in time and redefine back then we are taking ownership of the ring, and the husband did not have a right, did not have ownership rights to the ring that can thereby affect an act of betrothal, an act of marriage. Some say this is a problem because you're being maftir l'mafreya. You're going back in time and saying this instead of in that moment or before the transaction had occurred. So Hafkas Kedushin may work on one level based on Hefker Beis Din Hefker, but does require another mechanism, which is the fact that when the ring was handed over at the time of Kedushin, the man said, Hariat Mekudeshet li b'tabat zo, I betroth you with this ring, Kedat Moshe v'Yisrael. Only so long as, the way we're using it here, so long as the rabbis agree to what I am doing. And the rabbis can, so if there's a problem, the rabbis have a way of interjecting themselves, because it's as if the husband was mekadesh al t'nai. There's a condition. The condition is that the rabbis agree to what he had just done. And if there's a reason that they don't agree, then the mechanism to unravel that marriage may rely in part, at least, to hefker beis din. Hefker, the ring didn't belong to the man, and therefore the husband and wife are not married. And one other example, we keep coming back to Shemitah, which is great because this is a Shemitah year, as we mentioned in this week in Mishna Yomi edition number 1. So one of the aspects of Shemitah, of course, is Shemitah's ksafim, that loans are canceled on the last day of the Shemitah year. The Gemara Gittin tells us that Hillel came along and enacted a radical enactment called the Prusbul. According to some, it was radical. According to others, it was a natural outgrowth of what was happening. So Prusbul is a way whereby we assign the debts to beis din, and therefore they can be collected after the Shemitah year. And this is something that we will be we have learned about earlier on in the year during my Shemitah classes. And again, it doesn't happen until the end of the year, the last day of Tafshin Pei Beis. That's when, right before Rosh Hashanah Tafshin Pei Gimel, that's when the loans are canceled. So we make sure to write a prusbul before that time. So the question is, how can a prusbul work? The Torah says that the loans are canceled. Comes along Hillel and says loans aren't canceled. How could that be? So if you hold that today, Shemitah ksafim bizman hazeh d'Rabbanan, it's not a Torah obligation. That on a Torah level nowadays, Shemitah, the cancellation of debts doesn't apply. So therefore, you could say that the rabbis, we practice Shemitah according to the rabbis, and the rabbis say prusbul works. But there's an opinion that says even if Shemitah ksafim bizman hazeh is d'oraisa, even if the cancellation of debts is a Torah level obligation, restriction today, prusbul could still work because of hefker beis din hefker. Again, we prefer to go according to the approach that Shemitah's ksafim is d'Rabbanan, and therefore there's more latitude. It's interesting to note that some suggest even if Shemitah's ksafim, the cancellation of debts today, is a Torah level obligation, the rabbis can come along and circumvent that obligation in some way, reassign those debts to beis din because of hefker beis din hefker. One last point, what type of beis din needs to be there in order for hefker beis din hefker to work? Some suggest it's only the beis din gadol. Only certain unique batei din in history have the gravitas, have the knowledge, have the stature, have the standing in order to accomplish hefker beis din hefker. And therefore, at times, for instance, today, when we don't have such a stature, a beis din of that stature, then the repercussions that we spoke about of the hefker beis din hefker can't apply, because we only do it when the actual beit din that we're dealing with is one of stature. However, others disagree. Famously, Yiftach Kedoro, Kishmuel Bedoro. Every generation deals with the scholars and the judges and the leadership that is in their generation. Might there have been generations of greater leaders? Maybe, but this is the Torah leadership, the judicial leadership that we have, the beis dins that exist, and therefore the ability of hefker beis din hefker continues to exist even to this day. Of course, the nafkamina between these two would be, for instance, when it came to prusbul, is prusbul operable at a time today when you don't have the greatest of batei din like we've had in the past, and therefore, since we don't have those batei din, maybe we can't do prusbul, or no, whatever batei din are available, that's the batei din that operate hefker beis din hefker and allow for prusbul. And so, practically speaking, we say we live with the leadership and the batei din as we have them today, and therefore hefker beis din hefker remains operable. Maybe we won't extend it, maybe we won't use it as often as greater batei din in history may have used it, but the concept exists. The concept exists, therefore prusbul is operable. And in fact, at the end of the year, come Elul, this upcoming Elul, 6 months from now or so, we will in fact have an opportunity for people to effect a prose bowl, thereby, as is customary and recommended, as the Shemitah year concludes. Thank you for joining me. Hope you tune in next time for another edition